She buried her husband in the spring, her daughter by summer, and by the time the first frost bit the plains, she was standing at the gate of a stranger's ranch with 31 cents, a broken suitcase, and a letter nobody believed in. The man inside had stopped feeding his own children properly. The woman watching from the window had already decided to hate her, and the kitchen, the one place Margaret Ellison had left in the world, was bare down to the bones. If you've ever had to rebuild your life from absolute zero, stay with me. This one's for you. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Like, share, and let's begin. The wagon driver didn't say a word the last 11 miles. That was fine. Margaret Ellison had run out of conversation somewhere around the second river crossing when the rear wheel cracked against a submerged rock and she'd had to climb down into ankle-deep freezing water to help push. The driver, a barrel-chested man named Cord who smelled permanently of pipe tobacco and wet leather, had grunted something that might have been an apology and then gone back to staring at his horse's hindquarters like they held the answers to life's great mysteries. So Margaret sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap, watching the Colorado high plains unspool around her, and she tried very hard not to think about the fact that she was riding toward a job she wasn't sure she'd get, in a place she'd never seen, for a man she'd never met, based entirely on a letter of introduction written by a Methodist minister who had known her mother 30 years ago. Not exactly a solid foundation. But then, she'd been building on shaky ground for most of the past year. The travel bag at her feet, brown leather, one brass clasp replaced with a strip of rawhide because the original had snapped in Memphis, held everything she owned in the world. 3 dresses, a wool shawl her mother had made, a small tin of dried herbs she'd been hoarding since Kansas City because you never knew, a photograph she hadn't been able to look at since July, wrapped in a square of muslin and pushed to the very bottom beneath her extra stockings. She didn't think about the photograph. She thought about the letter instead. To Mr. Silas Mercer of Briar Ridge Ranch, Colfax County, Colorado Territory. I write on behalf of Mrs. Margaret Ellison, widow, formerly of Nashville, Tennessee. I have known the Halloway family, Mrs. Ellison's people, for the better part of 3 decades, and I can attest to the character and capability of this woman without reservation. She is a skilled cook of considerable talent, a woman of steady temperament and moral uprightness, and she is in present need of honest employment. I commend her to you without qualification. Yours in faith, Reverend Thomas Aldrich, First Methodist Church of Abilene, Kansas. Margaret had read it so many times the fold lines were going soft. She wasn't sure why she kept reading it. Maybe because it was the most anyone had said about her worth in months. Maybe because Reverend Aldrich had been so genuinely kind when he'd written it, had sat across from her in his small office with his hands pressed flat on the desk and said, "Margaret, I am going to get you somewhere safe to land." And she had needed desperately to believe that someone could do that for her. She'd believed it enough to spend her last $7 on a stage ticket north and then west. The wagon hit a rut, and the bag slid against her ankle. She pressed it back with her foot without looking down. Don't think about it. Just get there. Briar Ridge Ranch appeared first as a smear of smoke against the late afternoon sky. Thin, gray, the kind of smoke that comes from a fire barely maintained rather than one properly tended. Then came the smell of cattle, and the distant sound of someone hammering something with more frustration than precision. Then the fence line, weathered posts listing at uneven angles like old men who'd given up on standing straight. Then the house. Margaret had expected rough. This was rougher than rough. It was a 2-story structure that had probably been handsome once, maybe 6 or 7 years ago when it was first built, but which now wore the particular look of a place that had received no love in a long time. The porch railing had a gap in it on the left side. One of the upper shutters hung by a single hinge. The yard between the house and the main barn was a crosshatch of dried mud ruts, old hay scattered across it like someone had given up sweeping halfway through. A dog lifted its head from the porch steps and regarded her with complete indifference, then put its head back down. "This the Mercer place?" Margaret asked. Cord finally spoke. "Yep." He pulled the horses up. He did not offer to help her down with her bag. She climbed down herself. The man who came around the corner of the barn was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was tall, lean in the way men got when they worked hard and ate poorly, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jaw that looked like it hadn't seen a razor in 4 or 5 days by design rather than neglect. His shirt was clean but worn through at the left elbow. He moved like someone whose body knew how to do the work, but whose mind was somewhere else entirely. He stopped when he saw her. Margaret stood her ground. She'd learned over this past year of moving from one uncertain place to the next that the first 10 seconds of meeting a stranger determined everything. You either planted your feet or you didn't. She planted hers. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her for a long moment, then at the wagon, where Cord was already turning his horses around with the aggressive efficiency of a man who wanted to be somewhere else before dark. "You're the woman Aldrich wrote about," Silas Mercer said. "Margaret Ellison." She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was solid and brief, the grip of a man who'd learned that a handshake was a transaction, not a courtesy. "You're smaller than I expected." "Most things look smaller when there's nothing around them to give scale," she said. "I imagine your pantry looks the same way right now." Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. "Word travels. Reverend Aldrich mentioned you'd had a difficult season." "Aldrich is a minister. Difficult is what ministers call everything short of catastrophe." He picked up the bag she'd set down and started toward the house. "Come on then, I'll show you what we're working with." Well, what they were working with was, in a word, grim. The kitchen was at the back of the house, a large room that had once been the heart of the place. She could see that in the bones of it, the wide stone fireplace, the solid oak work table, the iron range that was a good model, a garland, probably cost real money when it was new. But the room had the feel of a space that had been abandoned slowly, not all at once. The shelves were 3/4 bare. There was a half-empty sack of cornmeal on the floor, a few jars of things she couldn't identify, a small tin of lard, a string of onions hanging by the back door, most of them sprouted, some dried beans that had been sitting long enough to have the look of pebbles. "How many men?" she asked. "6 ranch hands, myself, and my 2 children." He paused. "Clara is 10. Will is 6. "Do they eat with the hands or separate?" "They eat with me. The hands take their meals in the bunkhouse. There's a small cook area there, but it hasn't been properly used in—" He stopped. "Since your wife passed," she said. She said it straight, not softening it into nothing, because she'd learned that softening it was worse. It was like touching a bruise through gauze. You still touched it. He looked at her. "Since then." "When was that?" 8 months ago. February? 8 months. And the ranch looked like it had been 8 years. But grief had a way of doing that, of making time buckle and stretch in ways that defied arithmetic. "What have they been eating?" she asked. "Salt pork when there was some. Biscuits when someone thought to make them. Whatever the men scrounged from their own stores." His voice was flat. She didn't think the flatness was indifference. She thought it was the voice of a man describing something he was ashamed of and couldn't find the energy to dress up. "I know it's not—" "It's fine," she said. "I've worked with less." She wasn't entirely sure that was true, but she needed to believe it right now, and she needed him to believe it. So she said it like it was a fact she was reporting rather than a hope she was clinging to. She set her bag against the far wall and moved to the shelves, beginning to inventory what was actually there, touching jars, opening lids, smelling things. "The children," she said, her back to him. "Do they sleep all right? Eat when food's put in front of them?" A pause. "Clara doesn't eat much. Will has nightmares." She nodded. She kept her face turned away from him so he wouldn't see whatever was moving across it. "All right," she said. "I'll need to ride into town for proper supplies eventually, but tonight I can work with this. Town's 9 miles. Then I'll need a horse. Tomorrow. Tomorrow's fine." She turned around. "Where do I sleep?" But the room she was given was small, a former storage room off the back hall, repurposed with a cot and a washstand and a lamp that worked if you held the wick down with a pin. It wasn't much. It was quiet, though. She'd learned to value quiet above almost everything else. She didn't unpack the bag. Not yet. Getting too comfortable before you knew you were staying was how you made the leaving harder. She washed her face and her hands, looked at herself in the small square mirror above the washstand. She was thinner than she'd been a year ago. The months of poor eating on the road had hollowed out her cheeks slightly. She had her mother's eyes, dark, direct, the kind of eyes people occasionally found unnerving because they didn't look away from things the way polite eyes were supposed to. She looked away from the mirror. She went to find the kitchen again. She nearly walked into the woman on the stairs. The woman was standing at the bottom of the main staircase in the front hall, arms crossed, wearing a dark green dress that was well-made and well-maintained, a stark contrast to everything else in the house. She was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely and a face that had probably been pretty once and had since decided to put that behind it. She was looking at Margaret with the particular expression of a person who has already made up their mind and is merely conducting the formality of a first impression. "You must be Mrs. Hale," Margaret said. The woman's eyes moved over her in a way that managed to be both brief and comprehensive. "And you're the cook Silas telegraphed for." "Margaret Ellison." That single syllable contained an entire essay of skepticism. "You're younger than I expected. I've been told I'll grow out of it." Mrs. Hale didn't smile. "I want to be plain with you, Mrs. Ellison. I have been managing this household since February, to the extent it can be managed. I know what's in the pantry and what isn't. I know what the children need and don't need. I am Silas's sister-in-law, and I have been here through the worst of it, which is more than I can say for—" She stopped herself, started again. "I want to be sure you understand the situation before you start making any grand plans." Margaret looked at her steadily. "I understand the situation, Mrs. Hale." "Do you? You're telling me you have a stake here. You're telling me not to come in and disrupt what you've built." Margaret kept her voice even. "I hear you. I'm not here to disrupt anything. I'm here to cook." Mrs. Hale studied her. The scrutiny was open, unhurried, designed, Margaret suspected, to make people uncomfortable enough to look away or start explaining themselves too much. Margaret did neither. "Dinner is normally served at 6, Mrs. Hale said finally. "Then I'll have it ready at 6. She went back to the kitchen. She found the children in there. The girl, Clara, was sitting at the oak work table with a book open in front of her that she wasn't reading. She had her father's dark hair and an expression of careful blankness that Margaret recognized immediately because she'd worn it herself. It was the face you put on when the world kept expecting things from you that you didn't have left to give. The boy, Will, was under the table, not hiding exactly, just under the table, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small carved wooden horse in his hands, turning it over and over. "Hello," Margaret said. She didn't crouch down, didn't do the thing adults did where they folded themselves up to get to a child's level as if that could paper over the fact that they were still strangers. She just addressed them both at normal height, like people. "I'm Margaret. I'm going to be cooking for a while." Clara looked up from the book she wasn't reading. "We had a cook before. She left. People do sometimes. She said it was too far from town." "That's a reason." "Do you think it's too far from town?" Margaret considered this honestly. "I think it's very far from town. I don't think that's a reason to leave." She moved to the shelves and started pulling things down. The cornmeal, the lard, the onions, the beans. "What do you usually have for supper?" A pause. Clara looked at her brother's feet, visible below the table hem. "Salt pork mostly, or biscuits." Another pause. "The biscuits haven't been very good." "No? Aunt Edith makes them. She's not—" Clara stopped. "She's not a natural cook," Margaret said, filling it in neutrally. "I wasn't going to say that. I know, but it's all right to notice things." Margaret found a cast-iron pot on a low shelf, turned it over, examined it. Good pot, just neglected. "What does your brother like to eat?" A small voice from under the table. "Cornbread." "Will," Clara said. "She asked," Will said. "It's all right." Margaret set the pot on the range and turned toward the fire to check what kind of heat she'd be working with. "Cornbread I can do. What else?" A longer pause from under the table. "Soup, with the stuff in it that gets soft. Vegetables. The soft kind." "Will, you don't have to—" Clara started. "It's fine," Margaret said again. She meant it. There was something almost comforting about the straightforwardness of what a 6-year-old wanted. Soup with soft vegetables and cornbread. No politics. No tests, just hunger and preference, stated plainly. Soup with soft vegetables and cornbread, that's a good supper. She looked at the shelves again. The beans would take too long, they'd need overnight soaking at least. But there were the onions, some sprouted but workable. And in the back of the bottom shelf, pushed behind a jar of something unidentifiable, she found 3 dried ears of corn still on the cob, overlooked. In a wooden crate near the back door, she found 4 potatoes that had seen better days but were still salvageable if you cut right. There was dried sage hanging above the window, and salt, and a small paper parcel of something she unfolded carefully to find flour. Not much, maybe 2 cups, but enough. She'd made meals out of less. She'd made meals out of almost nothing. In the months after the funeral, when she'd been staying with her cousin in St. Louis, and there had been 4 children to feed, and her cousin's husband's work had dried up, and everyone was quietly pretending things were fine, while inside everyone was in free fall. You learned in those months what you could make from nothing. You learned to look at a near-empty shelf and see what could become of it instead of what it lacked. She rolled up her sleeves and went to work. The ranch hands came in for supper at 6:10. 6 men ranging from about 20 to somewhere near 60, all of them wearing the expression of people who had long since stopped expecting anything interesting to happen at mealtimes. They filed into the bunkhouse cook area, which connected to the main house kitchen through a side passage, and they stopped when they smelled what was happening. "What is that?" said the youngest one, barely past 20, freckled, with the kind of red hair that would have made his mother worry about sunburn. "Sit down," Margaret said without looking up from the pot. "It smells like actual food," said another man, older, gray at the temples. He said it the way a man might say it smells like rain after a 6-month drought, with a kind of reverence that was almost embarrassing. "It is actual food," she said. "Sit down." They sat down. She ladled the soup first, potato and onion, built with the corn scraped from the dried ears for sweetness and body, seasoned with sage and salt, and a patience that she'd learned was itself a kind of ingredient, because rushing a soup was how you ended up with something that tasted like hot water with ambitions. It wasn't the soup she could have made in a full kitchen with a proper larder. It wasn't the soup she'd have made in her own kitchen in Nashville, the one on Cobb Street with the good stove and the herb garden out back, and she stopped that thought. It was, however, the best soup that could be made from those ingredients in that kitchen on that particular evening, and when she set the pot on the table and the men began filling their bowls, the silence that fell was the good kind of silence, the eating kind. The cornbread came out of the oven 12 minutes later, golden, not perfect, the bottom crust slightly thicker than she'd intended because the range ran hot on the left side, a quirk she'd have to map over time. And she cut it in the pan and set it on the table on a board she'd found, and she watched, from the corner of her eye, the youngest ranch hand tear a piece in half and put it in his mouth and close his eyes for just a second. "Ma'am," said the older man with gray temples. He said it like it was a complete sentence. "Eat," she said. Silas Mercer ate in the main dining room with Clara and Will and Mrs. Hale. Margaret served them there. She was the cook, that was the arrangement, and she moved quietly, setting bowls down and going back for the bread, and not intruding on the particular silence of a family meal that isn't quite a family. Not yet, and maybe not for a long time. Will ate the soup. He ate all of it, slowly, leaning over his bowl with a seriousness that was almost funny in someone so small. When he finished, he looked at the empty bowl, then looked at Margaret. "More?" she asked. He nodded. She ladled him more. Clara ate with more restraint, the careful eating of a 10-year-old girl who has been told, or has told herself, that she needs to hold herself together at all times, because holding herself together is the thing she's decided she can control. But she cleaned her bowl, and she reached for a second piece of cornbread without asking. And that second piece of cornbread felt like the most honest thing that had happened at that table in a long time. Silas ate without speaking. He looked once at the bread on his plate, then at some middle distance over Will's head, then back at his bowl. Something moved through his expression. Margaret caught it from the doorway, not watching deliberately, but not looking away either. She couldn't have named what it was exactly. Not grief, or not only grief. Something older than that. The look of a man who had forgotten, for a while, what it felt like to sit at his own table and have someone have cooked for him, and who was being reminded of it in a way that hurt slightly, the way coming back to warmth after cold hurt slightly at first. Mrs. Hale ate with perfect posture and said nothing. Margaret cleaned the kitchen alone afterward. She didn't ask for help, and nobody offered. That was fine. She worked methodically, scrubbing the pot first, then the bowls, stacking everything, checking the range, making note of what she'd need to do differently tomorrow. The corn was almost gone, but there was enough cornmeal for 2 more batches. The onions would last another week if she was careful. She needed potatoes, real ones, and beans that hadn't turned to stones, and flour, and eggs if the ranch had chickens. She hadn't seen any, but that didn't mean there weren't any. She needed to see the whole property in daylight. She was drying the last bowl when she heard the sound. It was small. Coming from the hallway, the narrow back hallway off the kitchen that led to the servants' quarters, which was where her room was. She hung up the drying cloth and walked to the door and looked out. Will was sitting on the floor of the hall, back against the wall, the wooden horse in both hands. He wasn't crying. He was doing something that was one step removed from crying, that particular stillness that comes right before or right after, when the body doesn't have anything left to produce but the weight of it is still sitting there on the chest, pressing down. Margaret sat down on the floor next to him. She didn't say anything, she just sat there. After a while he said, without looking at her, "I don't like the nighttime." "A lot of people don't," she said. "Do you?" She thought about it. "Sometimes, when I can hear crickets, I like it, or rain on a roof." "What about when it's quiet?" "When it's quiet, it's harder," she admitted. He turned the horse over in his hands. "My mama used to sit with me," he said, "when it was quiet, and I didn't like it." Margaret didn't say anything to that. There was nothing to say. The truth of it was complete in itself, and she'd learned the hard way that trying to say something useful to that kind of truth only made it smaller. They sat there together in the narrow hall for a few more minutes. Then Will got up, tucked the horse under his arm, and padded down the hall toward the stairs. "Night," he said. "Good night, Will," she said. She stayed sitting on the floor for a moment after he was gone, her back against the wall, looking at the dark end of the hallway. "Don't think about it. Don't think about her." She got up. She went to her room. She did not open the bag. She lay down on the cot in her dress because it was cold and she was tired, and she told herself to sleep. And eventually, after a long time, she did. She was up before first light. Not because she'd slept well, she hadn't exactly, but because she'd trained herself over the past year to treat sleeplessness as time rather than waste. You could lie there fighting it, which accomplished nothing, or you could get up and do something, which at minimum meant you were useful. She'd chosen useful. The kitchen was cold. She built the fire in the range first, working quietly so as not to wake the house. And when the iron began to tick and warm, she put water on and went through the pantry again by lantern light, making her proper inventory list on the back of an old receipt she found in a drawer. She was still writing when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:30. The girl was dressed, not in nightclothes, fully dressed, the same careful presentation as last night. Her hair was braided, slightly imperfect, the kind of braid a 10-year-old does herself in a mirror. "You're up early," Margaret said. "I'm always up early," Clara said. She came into the kitchen and stood near the range for warmth. "My mother used to get up early, too." Margaret didn't stop writing. "Did she?" "She said the morning belonged to whoever claimed it first." A pause. "I don't know if that's actually true, it's just what she said." "Could be both," Margaret said. "Things can be true and also something someone said." Clara watched her writing for a moment. "What are you doing?" "Making a list of what we need from town." "It's a long list." "It is." "Are you going to stay?" Clara asked. Straight out, no preamble. Margaret looked up from the list. The girl was watching her with those careful eyes. The eyes of someone who had asked this question before, or variations of it, and had learned to brace for the answer. "I don't know yet," Margaret said, because that was honest, and she'd decided when she walked through the gate that whatever else she did here, she would not lie to the children. "I'm going to give it a real try. That's what I can promise." Clara considered this. Whatever she concluded, she kept to herself. "Breakfast is usually just biscuits," she said. "I noticed. How about something else today?" "Like what?" I found some salt pork in the cold box. I can do fried pork and cornmeal mush. It's not glamorous, but it's warm and it sticks. Clara made a face that was trying not to be a face. Will likes sweet things in the morning. I'll put a little molasses on his if there's any. There's some in the back of the second shelf, behind the lamp oil. Thank you. Margaret went to find it. Can you set the table? A pause. Brief, surprised. You want me to help? If you don't want to, you don't have to. Another pause. Then Clara went and found the plates. Silas came downstairs at 6. He stopped in the doorway of the kitchen the way his hands had stopped in the bunkhouse. That same arrested moment, that reorientation to a smell that didn't belong to the recent history of the house. Then he came in and sat at the table where Clara was already seated and Will was working through his mush with the molasses on top, very seriously, as if eating were a task that required full concentration. Smells good, Silas said. It came out slightly stiff, the way a compliment comes from someone who isn't used to giving them. Thank you. Margaret set a plate in front of him. I need to get to town today. I've got a list. I said I'd arrange a horse. I know. I wanted to remind you. She sat down across from him, not at the head of the table, at the side, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She had the right, she decided. She'd made the coffee. Silas looked at the list she'd set on the table. His eyes moved down it. She watched his expression, looking for the thing she'd seen in men before. The look that said, I can't afford this. The look that said, I don't have that. The look that retreated into defensiveness because the list had made concrete something he'd been successfully not looking at. He didn't make that face. He looked at the list like a man looking at a map of territory he needed to traverse. Some of this I can get from the Hendersons, he said. Neighboring ranch. They owe me from spring. Whatever helps. The eggs. We have chickens. They're in the old coop behind the east barn. Clara can show you. He looked at Clara. Can you show her? Yes, Clara said. I'll need someone to carry things from town, Margaret said. I'm assuming I can't drive the wagon myself. Hector can go with you. He meant she assumed one of the ranch hands. He knows the roads. All right. Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway then, fully dressed as before, taking in the scene. The table, the food, Silas eating, the children eating, Margaret sitting at the side with a coffee cup. And something moved through her face that was too complicated to categorize quickly. Good morning, Edith, Silas said. Morning. She came to the table and sat. Margaret set a plate in front of her. Mrs. Hale looked at it. You were up early, she said, directing it at Margaret. I was. The kitchen was already warm when I came down at 5. I work better in the morning. A pause. Catherine preferred the evening, Mrs. Hale said. Catherine. The name landed on the table and sat there. Will looked at his moosh. Clara looked at the window. Some people do, Margaret said. Neutral. Not filling the space the name had opened, not backing away from it. Mrs. Hale picked up her fork. The mush is adequately seasoned, she said. Coming from Mrs. Hale, Margaret suspected, that was equivalent to a standing ovation. Clara showed her the chicken coop after breakfast. There were 11 hens, fewer than there should have been, Clara explained, because a fox had got into the coop in September, and nobody had thought to properly reinforce the wire until too late. The remaining hens were scrappy and unimpressed with Margaret's arrival, but they were laying. She counted 9 eggs in the nest, still warm. Do you collect them every day? Margaret asked. I used to, Clara said. She was standing at the coop entrance, watching Margaret collect eggs into her apron hem. I stopped for a while. After February? Yes. That makes sense. Clara leaned against the fence post. Aunt Edith didn't think so. She said we had to keep doing things, that stopping doing things was... She stopped. What? Indulgent was the word she used. Margaret looked at her. Clara's face was carefully arranged. Your aunt loves this family, Margaret said. She handles grief differently than some people do. She handles everything like it's a problem to be organized. Sometimes that's all you know how to do. She moved to the last nest. It doesn't mean she's wrong about everything. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, she said you looked poor. Margaret glanced at her. Clara had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but she held the eye contact. She said it to my father last night after supper. I heard from the stairs. Another pause. I thought you should know. Thank you, Margaret said. She meant it. She went back to the eggs. She's not wrong either. I'm not well off. Does it bother you, what she said? Margaret thought about it honestly, the way she'd decided to be honest with this child. It bothers me a little, she said. Not because she said I look poor, because she meant it as a reason I shouldn't be trusted, and I'd rather be judged on what I can do than on what I have. Clara absorbed this. That seems reasonable, she said. The gravity of it, a 10-year-old girl delivering judgments on what was reasonable, was almost funny, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest, some knot loosened by one small increment. Come on, she said. Help me get these inside before one of those hens changes her mind. Clara almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it was close, very close. Hector turned out to be the gray-templed man from supper. His name was Hector Vela. He'd been with the Mercer Ranch for 11 years, and he drove the supply wagon with the quiet competence of a man who had learned that most things were best done without commentary. He was not unfriendly, exactly. He was economical. He answered what was asked of him and volunteered nothing, which was, Margaret discovered, a quality she found restful. The 9-mile ride to town was cold. The wind off the plains had a bite to it that suggested the season was getting serious about turning, but the sky was the particular clear blue of high-altitude October, and the light on the grass was golden, and Margaret sat on the wagon seat and looked at the country around her and thought, not for the first time and probably not for the last, that it was not hard to see why people came out here, why they stayed. The hardest place she'd ever been had also been the most honest about what it was. The town was called Garnet Fork, population perhaps 200 on a good day. The general store was run by a compact woman named Mrs. Osterhaus, who knew immediately that Margaret was new to the area and who had opinions about most things but expressed them indirectly, through questions. "You're at the Mercer place, then?" she said as she filled Margaret's order. "Yes, ma'am." They've had a time of it. Packages being counted and stacked. Catherine Mercer was a good woman. Whole territory felt her loss. "So I've gathered." A glance over the counter. "The children are doing? They're managing. And Silas? He's managing too," Margaret said. "We all are." Mrs. Osterhaus looked at her for a moment with the evaluating eye of a woman who has seen many things pass through a small town and has learned to take accurate inventory. Then she nodded slightly, as if some private account had been settled, and went back to packing flour. "You'll need extra salt pork through the winter," she said. "The road to Garnet Fork gets bad in January. Stock up while you can." "I'll keep that in mind. And you might want to know, there's a kitchen garden plot behind the main house at Briar Ridge. Catherine kept it up right until the end. Nobody's touched it since." Margaret went still for just a moment. Then, "Thank you. I didn't know." "No reason you would." More packages. "You're starting from scratch either way." On the ride back, with the wagon loaded and the afternoon light going amber and sideways, Hector said without preamble, "The soup last night was the best meal this ranch has seen in a year." Margaret looked at him. He was watching the road. "Thank you," she said. "Wasn't a compliment exactly. Was an observation." He paused. "Those men have been making do for a long time. Some of them have been thinking about moving on, finding a ranch where things are run proper." She understood what he was telling her. "I see. A cook doesn't run a ranch," he said. "But she runs the part that holds everything else together." He glanced at her sideways. "You know what I'm saying?" "I know what you're saying, Hector." He went back to watching the road. "Cold front coming in from the north," he said. "Going to be a hard winter." "Most things that are worth something are hard," she said. He didn't respond to that, but she saw in the corner of his profile the very slight adjustment that was Hector Vela's equivalent of a smile. She was up late that night, building out a week's worth of menus in her head, adjusting for what she'd bought and what Silas had said he could get from the neighboring Hendersons, calculating quantities and timing. She'd need to start the beans tomorrow morning so they'd be ready by evening. She'd get a proper broth going from the pork bones she'd bought in town. She needed to look at that kitchen garden. Even if nothing was left worth using, she could start planning for spring. Spring. She caught herself thinking about spring and felt something she couldn't quite name, like she'd already decided something she hadn't consciously decided yet. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle in the distance, one of the horses shifting in the barn, the creak of the house settling in the cold. Somewhere above her, she heard small feet cross the floor. Will, probably. His room was above the back hallway. The feet stopped, then started again, then stopped. She listened until they stopped for good, and then she lay down in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not reach for the bottom of the bag where the photograph was, did not let herself think about it, did not spend the night walking backwards through things she couldn't change. She thought about tomorrow instead. Beans to soak, broth to start, a garden to look at, a family to feed. Start there, she told herself, start with what's in front of you. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something she could work with. The beans had been soaking since 4 in the morning. Margaret knew this because she'd been the one to put them in water at 4 in the morning, standing barefoot on the cold kitchen floor in the dark, listening to the house breathe around her. She'd learned, in the months since Nashville, that her body had stopped trusting sleep the way it used to. It would give her 4 or 5 hours and then pull her back up to the surface. Not urgently, just firmly, the way a hand might close around your arm and tug. Up. There are things to do. She didn't fight it anymore. By the time the ranch hands stirred at 5:30, the kitchen was warm, the broth was going, pork bones from yesterday's town run, an onion split in half and charred cut side down in the pan first, because that was how her mother had taught her, because the char gave it depth, gave it something. And Margaret was working through the flour she'd bought, calculating quantities, mapping out the week in her head the way she used to map the garden plot on Cobb Street, row by row. That was the thought she cut off. She was getting better at cutting them off. Not perfect. Better. Hector was the first one through the kitchen passage from the bunkhouse side. He stopped, assessed the situation with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything, poured himself a coffee from the pot on the range, and sat at the far end of the work table without being asked or asking. Broth, he said. For tonight, bean soup. He nodded, drank his coffee. After a moment, Mercer's going out to the east pasture this morning. Fence line's been giving trouble. All right. He'll be out through midday. She understood what he was telling her without quite saying it, that she'd have the house, and by extension the children, largely to herself through the morning. Whether he meant it as information or as something she should use, she wasn't sure. Maybe both. Thank you, Hector. He finished his coffee, set the cup in the dry sink, and went back through to the bunkhouse without another word. That was Hector. Complete sentences optional. Clara came down at her usual 5:30, hair braided, face arranged. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove and the table and the particular organized state of controlled activity that Margaret seemed to generate wherever she stood, and something in her face shifted very slightly from its default careful blankness. What do you need? Clara asked. It was the first time she'd offered. Margaret didn't make anything of it, didn't turn and smile or thank her with too much warmth, because she'd noticed that Clara pulled back from that kind of response, retreated slightly behind her careful face when adults made too much of small things. Eggs? Margaret said. 9 if the hens cooperated, and I need someone to tell me what was in that kitchen garden. Clara was quiet for a moment. I haven't been back there since... She stopped. Since last spring. We don't have to go today. No. A pause. I'll show you. They collected the eggs first. 8 this morning, one hen apparently having taken the day off for personal reasons, which Clara reported with a solemnity that almost made Margaret smile. Then Clara led her around the east side of the house, past the woodpile that needed splitting, another thing on the mental list, and through a gate in a low fence to a plot of ground about 30 feet square that ran along the south-facing wall of the house. It was not in good shape, but it was not hopeless either. The beds were overgrown with late-season weeds, the kind that moved in fast when no one was watching. The wooden markers Catherine Mercer had put in to label her rows were still there, though legible if you bent close. Carrots, beets, kale, sage, thyme. The sage and thyme had survived on their own, as herbs tended to do, sprawling and woody but alive. In the corner nearest the house wall, a rosemary bush had grown enormous and slightly wild, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice it again. Clara stood at the garden edge and looked at it. Margaret looked at Clara. "She planted it the first spring after Will was born," Clara said. She wasn't talking to Margaret exactly. She was talking to the garden, or to some middle space between them. She said you couldn't be sad about anything if you were busy worrying about whether the carrots were coming in. "Sounds like she knew what she was doing," Margaret said. She knew what she was doing about most things. Clara crouched down and pulled a weed from near the thyme, not with any evident purpose, just something to do with her hands. "I didn't come out here after. I thought maybe if I did it would—" She dropped the weed. "I don't know. It seemed like it would make it more real." "Sometimes that's true," Margaret said, "and sometimes the opposite is true. Sometimes not going near the thing is what keeps it too real." Clara looked up at her. The look was evaluating, the same look she'd turned on Margaret over the cornbread 2 nights ago, checking for false notes. Finding none, apparently, because she looked back at the garden and said, "The beets might still be in the ground, if the frost hasn't got them. Will you help me check?" They spent 40 minutes in the garden. They found 7 beets, small but sound. They found the remnants of a kale bed that was, astonishingly, still producing. Kale being kale, indifferent to adversity. They cut rosemary and thyme and bundled them with a piece of string Clara found in her pocket, the way children's pockets always contained exactly the unexpected thing you needed. When they came back inside, Clara's careful face had a small crack in it. Not enough to call an expression, just a hairline difference in the set of her eyes. Margaret put the herbs on the work table and said, without turning around, "Your mother kept a good garden." A long silence. Then Clara said, "Yes, she did." She went upstairs to wake Will for breakfast. Margaret started on the eggs. The crack in the careful face was small, but it was there. That was enough for now. The morning moved forward the way mornings did on a working ranch. Not gently, not giving anyone time to think too much. The men came through for breakfast, ate the eggs and bread Margaret had made, and spread back out across the property like a tide going out. Will appeared and worked through a bowl of cornmeal with the same focused seriousness he brought to all eating, and then asked Margaret if he could bring his horse to the kitchen. "The wooden one?" she asked. He nodded. "It can come as far as the doorway," she said. "But horses don't come into kitchens. Health regulations." He looked at her with the suspicious squint of a 6-year-old who suspects he is being managed. "Horses aren't real in kitchens. They're wooden. The regulations apply to all horses regardless of material. It's a firm rule." He considered this for an extended moment, clearly running through his options. Then, "Okay." And he set the wooden horse in the doorway, propped against the frame, facing in, which was apparently the compromise position that satisfied both the spirit of the regulation and the horse's desire to observe proceedings. Margaret went about her work. Will sat in the doorway next to the horse and watched her. He didn't talk, which she was beginning to understand was his natural state. He was a watching child, a noticing child, taking things in through his eyes rather than asking questions about them. After 20 minutes of silence, he said, "You're doing the stirring thing again." "The what?" "When you stir things, you count. In your head. Your lips move a little." She stopped stirring, then started again. "I didn't know that." "You do it every time," he said. "I was counting too. You go to about 30, and then you stop and check it. My mother taught me that. 30 stirs and check. If you rush it, things stick." "Did she teach you everything?" "Most of the kitchen things. Your mother probably taught you things too." "She taught me to tie my shoes," he said, "but I still can't do it right. Clara does them." "We can practice if you want." He thought about it. "Maybe." That was the end of the conversation. He went back to watching. The horse watched too from the doorway. It was not a terrible morning. The trouble came after lunch. It came in the form of Mrs. Edith Hale appearing in the kitchen at 1:30 with a look on her face that Margaret had come to recognize as the look of a woman who had been composing something in her head for several hours and had finally decided to deliver it. "I want to speak plainly," Mrs. Hale said. "I'd expect nothing less," Margaret said. She was working on the bread dough and she didn't stop. Stopping felt like yielding ground. "I spoke to Silas this morning before he left." Mrs. Hale came to stand at the other side of the work table. The table between them felt deliberate. I told him I had concerns. About me. About the arrangement. She folded her hands on the tabletop. It was a habit, Margaret noticed, this folding of hands. It was how Mrs. Hale kept herself from fidgeting, or maybe from doing something more aggressive. You've been here 3 days. You've rearranged the pantry, taken stock of the kitchen garden, which was Catherine's private. She stopped herself, restarted. You've been taking the children into the yard without telling anyone. I told Clara I was going to the garden. She offered to come. She's 10 years old. Yes, and she's not a baby. She knows where the garden is and what's in it and what it means to her, and she made her own choice to go. Margaret kept working the dough. I didn't drag her anywhere, Mrs. Hale. That garden. The folded hands tightened. You don't know what that garden meant to this family. I know more than you might think, Margaret said. Clara told me her mother planted it the spring after Will was born. She told me she hadn't been back since February because she thought it would make things more real. She paused in her kneading. She went back, and she found beets and kale still growing, and she pulled some weeds, and she came inside a little lighter than she went out. I won't apologize for that. Mrs. Hale was quiet for a moment. The silence had a different quality than her usual silences, less composed. You're very sure of yourself, she said finally. Not particularly, but I know what I saw this morning. You've known this child for 3 days. That's true. Margaret started working the dough again. I also knew my own daughter for 2 years and 4 months, and I know what the face of a child carrying something looks like, because I had to watch it, and I couldn't fix it, and I know the difference between a child being pushed somewhere painful and a child choosing to walk somewhere hard on their own terms. Her voice came out even, because she'd made it be even, and she did not look up from the dough. I wasn't pushing Clara, I was following her lead. The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Hale said, after a moment, I didn't know about your daughter. It wasn't in Reverend Aldrich's letter. A pause. She died in July. Her name was Anna. More quiet. Something in the room had shifted. A degree of temperature, a pressure, something. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale said. It came out stiff because she wasn't a woman built for easy sympathy, but Margaret heard under the stiffness that she meant it. Thank you. Neither of them said anything else for a while. Margaret worked the dough. Mrs. Hale stood at the other side of the table, and whatever she'd come in to say, the full delivered version of it, she kept to herself. Then she said, The beets. How are you planning to use them? Margaret glanced up. In the soup tonight, with the beans and some of the kale. Catherine used to add a spoonful of vinegar at the end. It brightens everything. I usually do the same. A pause. Then something happened on Mrs. Hale's face that Margaret hadn't seen before. Not a smile exactly, more the precursor to one. The muscles moving in that direction and then thinking better of it. She always served bread on the side. Not in the soup. I'll have bread. All right. Mrs. Hale straightened, smoothed the front of her dress. I'll stay out of your kitchen this afternoon. You're welcome in the kitchen whenever you like, Mrs. Hale. It's not my kitchen. A long look. No, but you run it like it is. She left before Margaret could respond to that. Margaret stood at the work table looking at the space where she'd been. Then she went back to the dough, and she counted her strokes, and her lips moved very slightly, and she thought about the vinegar and about what it meant that Edith Hale had offered it, and she filed that away with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. 30. She stopped and checked the dough. It was right. Silas came back from the east pasture at 3:30 with a long tear in his left jacket sleeve and the look of a man who had spent his afternoon losing an argument with a fence. He came through the kitchen, not the front door but the back, the working entrance, knocked the mud off his boots before he came in, and stopped in the middle of the room and looked around at the state of it. It looked different than it had 3 days ago. Not transformed, nothing dramatic, but worked in. The organized chaos of an active kitchen. Things in their places because someone had decided where their places were. The range radiating proper heat. The smell of the broth that had been going low and slow all day. The bread in its pans rising near the warmth. Long day? Margaret asked without looking up. Long enough? He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window. Clara says you found the garden. She found it. I was there. There's not much left in it. Enough. There'll be more in spring if someone gets it turned and planted. She paused. I can do that, if I'm still here. He turned from the window. She felt the weight of the look without meeting it. Are you planning not to be? He asked. I'm not planning anything. I'm working one day at a time. That's not a straight answer. It's the straight answer I have. She turned to face him then. I won't promise you things I can't keep, Mr. Mercer. I can promise you that I'm here today and tomorrow and that I'm going to feed your family well and do the work I said I'd do. Further than that, she shook her head slightly. I've learned not to promise further than that. He looked at her for a long moment. There was something behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read. Not irritation, something more complicated, the look of a man who understands a thing because he is living the same principle himself. Fair enough, he said finally. He finished his water, set the glass down, and went toward the hall, stopped in the doorway. The fence needed 40 yards of new wire and I had 20. Hector's going to have to ride to Garnet Fork this week. While he's there, he can pick up salt pork. I put it on the list. A pause. You already put it on the list. I anticipated the fence problem. The fence lines on the east side looked worn when I came in on the wagon. He turned and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Not gratitude exactly, not even surprise. Something between the two. The look of a man who has been operating alone for long enough that competence in another person has started to feel foreign. I'll tell Hector, he said. He left. Margaret turned back to the stove. The broth had been going 8 hours now. She lifted the lid and checked it, adjusted the heat, added a tied bundle of the thyme and rosemary from the garden, replaced the lid. The beans were soft enough to begin adding to the pot. She started the bread baking at 4. She cut the beets and blanched them, added them to the pot with the kale, and watched the color bleed into the broth, that deep, serious red purple that beets produced, turning the whole thing into something that looked like it had been made with intention, even if the ingredients had been scraped together from the edges of a failing season. At 5:30, Will appeared in the kitchen doorway. The wooden horse was already under his arm. Can the horse be in the doorway? He asked. Same as before. He arranged the horse against the doorframe and sat down next to it. He watched her finish the soup in silence. Then, it's red. From the beets. Is it going to taste like beets? It's going to taste like everything. The beets are just one thing. He thought about this. Like how when you mix colors, you get a different color. Something like that. You still have the red and the other things in there. You just can't see them separately anymore. He was quiet for a while, working through this in whatever way he worked through things. Then, my mom made soup with beets before. Did you like it? I don't remember. A pause. I think so. It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother directly to her. She didn't turn around. She kept stirring, kept her voice at the same register it had been before. That's usually how the best food is. You don't remember deciding you liked it. You just know you do. He leaned against the doorframe and watched the steam curl up from the pot. Is dinner ready soon? 20 minutes. Okay. He picked up the horse, put it down again. Margaret? Yeah? Why do you stir things so much? So they don't stick. What happens if they stick? You lose the good parts at the bottom. They burn. She lifted the spoon, let a stream of the deep-colored broth run back into the pot. The best flavor's always at the bottom. You have to keep it moving so it doesn't burn. He looked at her. She still had her back to him, but she could feel him looking, the particular weight of a 6-year-old's full attention. Okay, he said. He seemed satisfied with this, the way children were sometimes satisfied with answers that weren't really about what they'd asked. He got up, tucked the horse back under his arm, and went to wash his hands for dinner without being told. Margaret stood at the stove. She added the spoonful of vinegar. She'd told Mrs. Hale she would, and she hadn't said that just to say it, and she stirred it through and tasted it, and it was right. The vinegar did what it always did, cut through the heaviness, made everything present, pulled the flavors forward. She put the lid back on. She went to cut the bread. Dinner that evening was different from the first night. Not dramatically. There was no ceremony, no announcement. It was just that the people sitting at the table were sitting slightly differently. The ranch hands, in the bunkhouse, had been expecting it to be good this time. She could hear them through the passage, the different quality of the noise before the meal, a kind of restless readiness. The youngest one, The freckled redhead, whose name she'd learned was Pete, had come by the kitchen side passage in the afternoon on a thin pretext about needing to know if there was more coffee, and had stood for a moment just breathing in the smell of the broth with an expression of unguarded contentment. In the dining room, Clara sat down and unfolded her napkin and looked at the soup Margaret set before her, and looked at the bread on the board, and said, "It's red." "Beets," Will said immediately, with the authority of one who has been thoroughly briefed. "From the garden?" Clara asked. "Yes," Margaret said. Clara looked at the soup for a moment. Then she picked up her spoon. "Okay." She ate. She ate all of it, without the careful restraint of the first nights, the performance of not wanting too much. She ate like a child who was hungry, and the food in front of her was good. Across the table, Silas watched his daughter eat. He had both hands around his bowl, and he was watching Clara with the look of a man watching something he'd been afraid he wasn't going to see again. It was a private look. Margaret caught it from the door and looked away immediately, because some things weren't meant to be witnessed. Mrs. Hale, sitting at the far end, ate her soup and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, to no one in particular, "The vinegar is right." "Thank you," Margaret said from the doorway. "Don't thank me. It's an observation." But the precursor thing happened on her face again. That small movement in the direction of something warmer. After supper, after the dishes, Margaret went outside. Not for any reason she could have articulated exactly. The kitchen was done, and the house was settling into its nighttime rhythms, and she needed, suddenly, the cold air and the open sky. She stood on the back step and looked out over the yard toward the barn, and she could see light in the bunkhouse windows and hear the low sound of men's voices carrying across the dark. And above everything, the sky was doing what the Colorado sky did at night, opening up in a way that felt almost reckless, stars stacked on stars, more than you needed, more than made sense. She stood there in the cold until she stopped needing to. Then she heard the screen door behind her and turned to find Silas Mercer standing on the step. He had his jacket on and a coffee cup in his hand, and he'd clearly come outside for the same vague reason she had. They stood there side by side for a moment, both looking at the barn. "My wife planted that rosemary the second spring we were here," he said. He wasn't looking at her. "She said it would take forever to get established. Said you had to be patient with rosemary or it would spite you. Seems like it eventually cooperated. Took 3 years. She almost gave up on it twice." A pause. "Clara cut some of it today." "Yes, for the broth." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all right," he said. He said it like he was telling himself as much as her. "That's all right." She didn't say anything. The cold settled around both of them, comfortable in its way, honest. "Will ate 3 bowls," Silas said. "I know. I counted." "He hasn't eaten like that since—" He stopped. "He's hungry," Margaret said. He was waiting for someone to make something worth being hungry for. She paused. They both were. Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. Above the barn, a nightbird of some kind cut across the star field and disappeared. "Mrs. Hale spoke to you today." "She did. She told me." He looked sideways at her. "She said you gave as good as you got." "I said what was true." "That's pretty much what she said, too." He drank some coffee. She's not easy. She wasn't easy before Catherine died, and she's less easy now, but she loves those children. She's been here every day since February because she didn't have anywhere else she needed to be as much as here." "I know," Margaret said. "I could see that, under the rest of it." He nodded slowly. "She's not wrong that you've moved fast. There wasn't time not to. The pantry was empty and the children weren't eating and your men were thinking about leaving." She said it plainly, not to criticize, just to name what had been true. Sometimes moving fast isn't impatience. It's just what the situation asks for. He didn't argue with that. After a while he said, "You mentioned a daughter. Edith told me." "Yes. I'm sorry." "Thank you." Two people standing in the cold who both knew that "I'm sorry" didn't cover it, and nothing else did either. There was a particular solidarity in that, Margaret thought, the solidarity of insufficient language. "I should get in," she said. "Yeah." He didn't move immediately. Neither did she. The ranch sat around them in the dark, imperfect, worn down, stitched together, and threatening to come apart at several seams, and also, underneath all of that, still here, still standing. The cattle moving somewhere in the dark, the light in the bunkhouse windows. The rosemary in the garden she couldn't see from here but knew was there, enormous and wild and waiting for spring. "Thank you," Silas said, "for today." It was just supper. It wasn't just supper. She thought about denying it. Didn't. "No," she said. It wasn't. She went inside. She cleaned the last cup she'd left soaking in the dry sink, hung it on its hook, checked the damper on the range to keep the overnight heat right. She moved through the routine of closing up a kitchen with the same care she gave everything, because a kitchen left properly at night was a kitchen that started right in the morning, and there was a long winter ahead, and they were going to need every good start they could get. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of the cot. She reached toward the bag and stopped, held her hand there in the air for a moment. Then she let it fall to her lap. Not tonight. Tonight she was going to think about tomorrow. About the bread she'd need to start earlier, about the chicken she thought she might be able to get from Hector's bunkhouse stores if she asked, about the way Clara had almost smiled at the garden gate, about Will's 3 bowls of soup. Start there, she told herself again. Start with what's in front of you. She lay down on the cot, and the ranch sounds came in through the thin wall, wind and cattle, and the ordinary music of a place trying to hold itself together. And she let them come, and she didn't fight them. And after a while, they were just part of the night, and after a while longer, she slept. The supplies from the Henderson ranch arrived on a Thursday, hauled over in 2 trips by a Henderson boy who couldn't have been older than 16, and who seemed deeply uncertain about where to put things until Margaret directed him with enough specificity that he stopped hesitating and started moving. 4 dozen eggs, a wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, 2 bushels of winter squash, good firm ones, a smoked ham that made Pete, the freckled ranch hand, actually stop walking mid-stride when he came through the kitchen passage and caught the smell. "Is that a real ham?" he said. "It's a real ham," Margaret confirmed. "Like an actual—" "Pete." "Yes, ma'am." "Go find something to do." He went, but she heard him telling someone about the ham before he'd even cleared the yard. It was the end of the 2nd week, 14 days since she'd stepped off Cord's wagon with her 31 cents and her worn bag, and her letter that nobody had been sure would be enough. 2 weeks of early mornings and inventory lists and learning the specific complaints of the Garland range. It ran hot on the left, cold in the back right corner, and there was a drafting issue with the flue that meant certain winds would push smoke back down into the kitchen if you didn't watch the damper. And 2 weeks of learning the specific habits of this household, which were as individual and stubborn as the range's quirks. Will ate fastest when he was worried about something, slow when he was content. Clara, when the food was genuinely good, would stop eating at the 2/3 point and just sit for a moment before finishing, as if she needed to acknowledge that she was enjoying it before she let herself continue. Silas ate whatever was in front of him without appearing to taste it, usually, except on the evenings when he was tired enough that his defenses came down. And then he'd eat slowly and sometimes look up with an expression that wasn't quite present, like part of him was eating somewhere else, at some other table, in a different February, before everything. Mrs. Hale ate properly and commented rarely, but when she commented it was almost always accurate. 14 days, and Margaret knew all of this. She'd been watching, because watching was what she knew how to do, and because knowing the people you cooked for was how you cooked for them properly, and because there was nothing else she was certain of in this world right now, except this particular skill. The ham changed things at supper that night. She baked it low and slow with the last of the molasses and some of the mustard she'd found at the back of a shelf, and she roasted the squash with butter and a scraping of the hard cheese over the top, and she made real biscuits. Not Edith's biscuits, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because she had enough flour now and enough technique. And when she set the table in the dining room and called the household, the 4 of them came in and stopped. Will said, "Oh." Clara said nothing, but she sat down fast, which was its own kind of statement. Silas looked at the table and then at Margaret with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved by something. A slight tension around his eyes, like he was working to keep his face from doing something more than he intended. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "My mother's kitchen," she said. "Sit down before it gets cold." Even Mrs. Hale ate with something other than correctness that evening. She had a second biscuit. She didn't comment on it, and nobody else did either, but Margaret noticed, the way she noticed everything. After supper, after the dishes, Silas found her in the kitchen working on the week's supply list. He sat down at the work table across from her. Not the stance of a man coming to deliver something, just a man sitting at a table because there was nowhere else he particularly needed to be. The Henderson boy said his father wants to know if you'd be willing to cook for a gathering they're putting together in December, he said. Margaret looked up. A gathering? Winter social. They host one most years, 30, 40 people from across the territory. He turned a coffee cup in his hands. I said I'd pass it along. I'm not telling you what to do. It'd be additional work. It'd be additional pay? Yes. She considered. Would you need me here that day? I can manage one day. Then I'll think about it. She went back to her list. How's the east fence? Better. Hector and I spent 2 days on it. A pause. Still needs work in the spring. There's a lot in this place that needs spring. Yes. He said it without self-pity, just as a fact he was acquainted with. There is. She wrote flower on the list, and then looked at the word and thought about something that had been sitting in the back of her mind for 3 days since the Henderson supplies had arrived, and she'd started to see what was actually possible here with decent provisions and the time to work properly. There's a root cellar, she said, behind the east barn. Clara showed me. I know there is. It's half empty. What's in it is going to last through maybe January if we're careful. He said nothing. He knew what she was building toward. If someone digs and banks it proper before the ground freezes, she said, and if the garden gets turned and planted early in the spring, real planting, planned out, not just whatever seed is available, this place could feed itself through most of the year. Not everything, but most. She set down her pencil. I'd need to know it was going to happen, that there was a point to planning it. You're asking if you're going to be here in the spring, he said. I'm asking if there's a reason to plan like I will be. He was quiet for a long time. The range ticked. Outside, the wind had picked up, doing its November thing against the walls. What would you need? He asked finally. Seed money. Actual seeds, ordered before January. Time in the spring to work the garden properly, which means someone else handles the kitchen some mornings. She paused. And a reason. A reason. I've been a temporary thing my whole life lately, she said. Moving from one place to the next because I had to, not because I chose to. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking if there's work here worth doing past the winter, because if there is, I want to do it. And if there isn't, I'd rather know now while there's still time to make other arrangements. He turned the cup in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was thinking, handling something while his mind worked, as if the physical contact kept him grounded. There's work here, he said, more than I can list. He looked at her directly. I'd like you to stay. She picked up her pencil. Then I'll plan for spring. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was 2 people at a kitchen table in November making a practical decision. But when she looked down at her supply list and added seeds, order by December at the bottom, her hand was not entirely steady. She didn't mention that. She ordered seeds. The hard freeze came in the last week of November, which meant the ground locked up before she'd been able to get as much turned in the garden as she wanted. But she got the rosemary properly pruned and mounded for protection, and she got the kale beds cut back right, and she got the onion sets in before the ground went completely solid, which was more than had been done the year before. The ranch hands helped, in the undemonstrative way that men helped when they respected someone's work. Hector showing up with a spade one morning without being asked, Pete carrying compost from the barn with more energy than the task required, the oldest hand, a man named Roy, who had worked cattle since before Margaret was born, appearing at the garden fence and watching her work with an expression of neutral approval. Your rows are straight, Roy said. My mother was particular about rows, she said. Straight rows are faster to work, he said. Took me 30 years to believe that. He went back to whatever he'd been doing. For Roy, that was the complete extent of a compliment. The house itself was changing too, slowly, the way houses did when someone was paying attention to them. Not the big repairs, those were Silas's territory, and the winter wasn't the time for them, but the accumulated small things that spoke of whether a place was cared for or merely occupied. Margaret had found a crack in the kitchen window frame that was letting cold air seep in, and she'd packed it with oiled cloth as a temporary measure and told Silas it would need proper repair in spring, and he'd nodded and written it in a notebook he'd started keeping, which was itself a change. The notebook meant he was planning forward. Before, she suspected, the future had been a place he couldn't afford to look. Clara started helping with the kitchen voluntarily, not every day, but several times a week, appearing after school and standing at the work table with a look of focused interest. She had, Margaret discovered, a good palate, precise and honest. She would taste something and report exactly what she tasted without the softening that adults did, without saying it's good when it wasn't quite right. "The stew is salty," she said one afternoon, directly, without apology. Margaret tasted it. "You're right. What would you do? Add water or more potato to absorb it?" "Potato," Margaret said. "Water thins the flavor. Potato takes the salt without taking anything else." She handed Clara a potato and the peeler. "You do it." Clara peeled the potato, cut it, added it to the pot. They waited. Clara tasted again. "Better," she said. "Better's not the same as right." "I know." She tasted once more. "It's right now." Margaret looked at her. Clara was looking at the pot with a focused expression that was something close to satisfaction. "You have a good sense for it," Margaret said. "For cooking?" "For knowing when something's right. A lot of people never develop that. They need a recipe to tell them." Clara considered this. "My mother could tell by smell whether the bread was done. She never used the clock." "That's a long way past where you are now," Margaret said. "But it's the same thing, developed further." She went back to her own work. "You could get there." Clara didn't respond to that, but she stayed in the kitchen for another hour, which she didn't always do. The crisis came on a Wednesday in early December. It came in the form of a letter. Hector brought it back from Garnet Fork on his weekly supply run, along with a package of salt and the squash oil Margaret had ordered. He set it on the kitchen work table without comment. It was addressed to Margaret Ellison in a hand she didn't recognize immediately, and then stood looking at for a moment before opening it. It was from her cousin in St. Louis. Her cousin Dorothy, who had 4 children and a husband whose work had, apparently, recovered, and who had been feeling guilty since July about the fact that Margaret had left in difficult circumstances. The letter was warm and rambling, and in the middle of it, about halfway down the second page, was the thing that mattered. "Edmund's firm has a position opening in the spring. They need a housekeeper for one of the partners, a Mr. Baxter, who keeps a good house in the city proper, and the pay is $12 a month with room and board included. I know you are settled somewhere at present, but I wanted you to know that if you wish to come back to St. Louis, I could put your name forward without delay. Edmund thinks well of Mr. Baxter and says the household is well run and would suit a woman of your capabilities. Please let me know your thoughts at your earliest convenience. $12 a month. Room and board in a city house. Dorothy's handwriting, Dorothy's kitchen table. The smell of St. Louis in spring. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket and went back to the bread she'd been making. She told no one about it. Or she didn't tell anyone for 3 days, which amounted to nearly the same thing, except that it was also the 3 days during which things fell apart and then came back together in a different shape. It was Will who broke something, and it was not his fault. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table, not the doorway this time, at the table itself, which was a recent development, his horse propped against the salt cellar while he worked on something with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil. Drawing, she thought. He drew sometimes, small, careful drawings of horses and barns and things he'd seen. He was working on something now with great concentration, and Margaret was working at the range, and it should have been an ordinary afternoon. What happened was that Will reached for the salt cellar and knocked the wooden horse off the table. It fell, and the head snapped off clean at the neck. Will looked at the 2 pieces on the floor. He picked them up. He held the head in one hand and the body in the other and looked at them, and then his face did something that Margaret had never quite seen it do in the 5 weeks she'd been here. It broke. Not gradually. All at once. The careful 6-year-old composure that he wore like armor just broke. He didn't scream or throw anything. He sat at the table holding the 2 pieces of the horse, and he cried, the deep silent kind of crying that is worse than noise, the kind where the body shakes and the sound comes in waves, and the person producing it looks like they're drowning in something that has no bottom. Margaret crossed the kitchen and crouched beside his chair. She didn't tell him it was all right. She didn't tell him they could fix it. She put her hand on his back and she felt him shaking, and she stayed there. "My dad made it," Will said. Through the crying, the words coming out in the uneven way of someone trying to talk and breathe at the same time. He made it for me when I was 4. I know, she said, even though she hadn't known. I know. If it's broken forever. She thought about 100 things she could say to that. None of them were true enough. Yeah, she said, it might be. Why does everything break? She didn't have an answer for that one either. She kept her hand on his back. He cried for a while longer, and she stayed where she was, not moving away, not trying to hurry it towards something better. Eventually, he slowed, stopped. He looked at the 2 pieces in his hands. My dad can fix it, he said. It came out uncertain, like a question dressed as a statement. He might be able to, Margaret said. The crack is clean. Wood like that sometimes glues back solid. Really? Really. Let's put the pieces somewhere safe and ask him tonight. Will set the 2 pieces carefully on the table. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He looked at Margaret with the eyes of a child who has been crying and is now slightly embarrassed about it, but not enough to apologize for it. Okay, he said. She went back to the range. Will picked up his pencil and went back to his drawing, though his hand shook slightly for the first few minutes. It was nothing in the grand scheme of a ranch, a winter, a family's grief, a broken toy, and a child crying in a kitchen. But when Silas came in at supper and Will showed him the 2 pieces of the horse and explained what had happened, and Silas sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the break with the focused attention of a man examining something that mattered enormously, and then said, I think I can fix this, bud. Let me get my glue pot. Something in that exchange, the father and the son at the kitchen table with the broken horse between them, was the most whole thing Margaret had seen since she arrived. She busied herself at the stove. She took the letter out of her apron pocket that night. She read it again. $12 a month. A city house. Dorothy's cooking, which was not bad nearby. A life that was comprehensible, that had edges she could see, that wouldn't ask her to be anything except competent in a measured way. She thought about the garden she'd planned for spring, the seed order she'd written out, Claire's face when she'd correctly seasoned the stew, Will's 3 bowls of soup on the second night, the notebook Silas had started keeping. She thought about a lot of things for a long time. Then she found a piece of paper and a pen and sat at the kitchen table. Will's pencil was still there. She moved it gently, and she wrote to Dorothy. Dear Dorothy, thank you for thinking of me and for Mr. Baxter's generous offer. Please give my regrets. I have found work that suits me, and I intend to stay through at least the spring. I will write more when I have time. I hope Edmund and the children are well. She sealed it. She put it on the shelf to go with Hector on his next trip to town. She did not feel certain. She did not feel the relief of a decision cleanly made. She felt the way she sometimes felt after adding vinegar to a soup, a sharpening, things coming into focus, the full complexity of what was in the pot becoming present and clear, and slightly more than she'd expected. She went to bed. The reckoning with Mrs. Hale came 4 days later, which was perhaps inevitable, because things with Mrs. Hale always came eventually. It wasn't planned. Margaret had been in the pantry doing a late November inventory, adjusting the winter projections, and Mrs. Hale had come to find the extra wool blankets she was sure were stored on the upper shelf, and the 2 of them had ended up in the small space of the pantry at the same time, which was tight enough that there was no pretending the other person wasn't there. I heard you got a letter from St. Louis, Mrs. Hale said. She was reaching for the shelf and not looking at Margaret. Edith Hale had a network, Margaret had come to understand, that involved knowing things without explaining how she'd come to know them. From my cousin, Margaret said. A job offer, I heard. You heard right. Margaret went back to her inventory. I turned it down. A pause. Mrs. Hale's hand stopped on the shelf. Why? Because I made a commitment here. A cook's agreement isn't... It wasn't just a cook's agreement, Margaret said. She said it quietly, not defensively. I told Clara I was going to give this a real try. I told her I'd plan for spring if there was a spring to plan for. That's the kind of promise I keep. Mrs. Hale was quiet. She pulled the wool blanket down from the shelf and stood holding it. I judged you poorly, she said. It came out the way hard things came out of Edith Hale, stiffly, quickly, like something expelled rather than offered. When you arrived, I decided you were... She stopped. I decided things about you before I knew anything. I know, Margaret said. Clara told me. Mrs. Hale closed her eyes briefly. Of course she did. She opened them. I said you looked poor. I meant it as more than a description of your dress. I know what you meant. I was wrong. Margaret looked at her. Edith Hale was standing in the pantry with a wool blanket in her arms and the expression of a woman who has been wrong and is not accustomed to it and is making herself say so because the alternative, going on without saying it, had become more uncomfortable than the saying. You were scared, Margaret said, not unkindly. Somebody new in Catherine's kitchen, somebody taking over something you'd been holding together by yourself for 8 months. That's not, Mrs. Hale started, then stopped. That's not wrong, she said. I know. Margaret turned back to her inventory. You don't have to apologize to me, Mrs. Hale, but I'll accept it if you want to give one. A long pause. The pantry was very small, and the two of them were very close together. I apologize, Mrs. Hale said, for what I said, and for how I said it. Thank you. You're us. You're good with the children. She said it like it cost something, this admission. Clara especially. Clara doesn't trust easily. I noticed. She's been talking about the garden, about what she's going to plant in spring. A pause. She hasn't talked about the garden since last winter. Margaret didn't say anything to that. She wrote something on her inventory sheet that didn't need writing down, just to have somewhere to look. The biscuits, Mrs. Hale said. I'm sorry? Mine. I know they weren't right. I know they were... She pressed her mouth together. I can't cook. I never could. Catherine always... She stopped again. I was trying to hold things together, and cooking was the one thing I couldn't... She stopped a third time, and this time what stopped her was that her voice had gone slightly unsteady, and Mrs. Edith Hale would sooner have put her hand in the range than let her voice go unsteady in front of someone else. The biscuits kept them fed, Margaret said. That's not nothing. They were terrible. They kept them fed, she said again firmly. You did what you could with what you had. That's the definition of the job. Mrs. Hale looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face, the careful severity, the composed authority she wore like the well-maintained dress, shifted very slightly, not breaking but softening, the way cold ground softened in the first week of spring, not yet ready to work, but no longer frozen solid. I'll get out of your way, she said. You don't have to. I have mending to do. She moved toward the pantry door with the blanket, stopped in the frame. Without turning, the ham last week was the finest thing I've eaten in this house in 2 years. She left before Margaret could respond. Margaret stood in the pantry with her inventory sheet. Outside, she could hear Pete splitting wood, the clean percussion of it, steady and purposeful. And from somewhere in the house above her, she could hear Will's feet on the floor, moving with more energy than they'd had when she arrived, back and forth, back and forth. The sound of a small boy who had somewhere to go and the inclination to get there. She looked down at her list. Root vegetables through January, manageable. Salt pork, adequate. Flour, she needed more. Seeds were ordered, arriving February. Spring was a long way off still, but it was a fixed point now, something to navigate toward, which was different from just moving forward without coordinates. She finished the inventory. She went back to the kitchen to start supper. She had a chicken she'd been planning for 2 days, and the remaining squash, and she was going to make something that took time and patience, something that couldn't be rushed, because they had both now. Time. On this ranch. In this kitchen. With these people. And she was going to use it right. She put the chicken in the pot. She started counting. December came in hard. The first real snowstorm hit on a Tuesday night. The kind that arrived without much warning and then stayed, piling up against the barn doors and drifting across the yard in the dark, so that by Wednesday morning the ranch looked like something from a different world entirely, white and muffled and reduced to its essential shapes. Silas and Hector spent the early hours digging out the barn entrance and breaking ice on the water troughs, and Pete and Roy worked on clearing the path between the bunkhouse and the main house, and Margaret built the kitchen fire up high and started a pot of oatmeal large enough for everyone and kept the coffee hot, and when the men came in shifts with red hands and fogged breath, she fed them and sent them back out and did it again. Will watched the snow from the kitchen window with his horse in both hands. Silas had repaired it with wood glue and a careful clamp overnight, the crack barely visible now, a thin line across the horse's neck that Will ran his thumb over sometimes with the thoughtful air of someone reading something written in a language he was still learning. "It's all different," Will said, looking out at the white yard. "Happens every year," Margaret said. "I know, but it still looks different every time." She looked at him for a moment. There was something in that observation, the acknowledgement that a thing could be familiar and still surprise you, that felt too large to respond to at 6 in the morning over oatmeal, so she let it stand and went back to the stove. The Hendersons' social was on the 15th of December, and Margaret had agreed to it, which she was now reconsidering on practical grounds because the 15th was 10 days away, and the snow currently closing the road to Garnet Fork made the 9-mile drive to the Henderson place feel like a theoretical proposition. But the weather broke by Friday. The roads hardened in the cold to a surface that was passable, if not pleasant, and Silas told her on Sunday evening that Hector could drive her over on the morning of the 15th and collect her by evening if she wanted to go. "It'll be good for people to know you're here," he said. He said it simply, not pressingly. "You mean it'll be good for the ranch?" she said, equally simple. "I mean both." She went. The Henderson place was larger than Briar Ridge, a prosperous operation, well-staffed and well-fed. That much was visible in the first 5 minutes. Eleanor Henderson, the wife, was a broad, decisive woman who had organized the winter social with the efficiency of a military campaign, and who met Margaret at the kitchen door with an appraising look that was nothing like Edith Hale's. It was the look of one working woman assessing another, professionally and without malice. "Silas Mercer's cook," Eleanor said. "Margaret Ellison. You're the one who got those ranch hands to stop talking about leaving." Margaret blinked. "I wasn't aware that was known." "Hector Vela's wife's sister is married to one of my hands," Eleanor said. "Everything is known eventually in this territory. Come in. I need someone who can manage the dessert table, and I have been told you can bake." She could bake. She spent the morning in the Henderson kitchen, which was 3 times the size of the one she'd been working in, and stocked with a liberality that made her briefly envious. And she made 4 pies, 2 apple, 1 mince, 1 dried cherry with a lattice top, and a stack of molasses cookies that Eleanor's youngest child began systematically stealing from the rack before they were properly cooled, and who Margaret allowed to continue because the look on the child's face was worth more than the missing cookies. The gathering itself, 34 people by her count, happened in the Hendersons' front rooms and spilled onto the cleared porch, where someone had strung lanterns that threw yellow light over the snow. Margaret stayed mostly in the kitchen, which was where she was comfortable, but Eleanor pulled her out twice to introduce her around, and each time Margaret found herself in conversations with women who had questions about provisions and preserving and how to get bread to rise properly at altitude, practical questions she could answer with precision. And somewhere in the middle of the second conversation, she realized she hadn't thought about St. Louis or Dorothy or Mr. Baxter's well-run city house in 3 hours. That was something. On the way home, in the wagon with Hector through the cold dark and the snow-quieted landscape, she said, "Hector, did you actually tell people the hands were thinking about leaving?" A pause. "Might have mentioned it to my wife." "And your wife mentioned it to her sister." "Information travels in a marriage," he said. He didn't sound particularly apologetic. "You were trying to make sure I stayed," she said. "By making sure people knew I was here and what I was doing." "I was stating facts," Hector said. Then, after a moment, "You needed reasons. I provided some." She looked at his profile in the dark. Hector Vela, 11 years at Briar Ridge, a man of extraordinary economy, who had sat at the end of her work table on her first morning and drunk his coffee and told her the ranch hands were thinking about leaving, not as a threat, as information she would know what to do with. "Thank you," she said. "Don't read too much into it," he said. "I'm too old to break in a new cook." She looked at the road ahead. "How long has this ranch been struggling?" A long pause. "Before Catherine got sick, things were manageable. After, Silas stopped planning. When a man stops planning, everything else stops too." He adjusted the reins. "The men stayed because they respected him, but respect only carries so far when the food is bad and the work has no direction." And now? Hector was quiet for a moment. Roy fixed the east barn door last week. Nobody asked him to. She understood. Roy, who had been at the ranch longer than anyone, who offered compliments about row spacing as the ceiling of his verbal expression, Roy had decided the ranch was worth fixing things in without being told. That was the measure of it. The proposal, which was not exactly a proposal, and also was exactly a proposal, happened on a Thursday evening in the third week of December. It happened in the kitchen, as most of the significant things at Briar Ridge had happened, because the kitchen was where the house's life collected. Margaret was working on a bread recipe she'd been adjusting for 2 weeks, trying to correct for the altitude's effect on the rise. And Silas came in at the end of the day and sat at the work table the way he'd taken to doing some evenings. Not always, not as a set habit, but often enough that his presence at that table no longer required explanation. He had his notebook. He looked at it for a while without opening it. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it right, which means I need you to let me finish before you respond." She looked at him. His jaw had the particular set of a man who has rehearsed something and is now worried the rehearsal was not sufficient. "All right," she said. "I know what this position is," he said, "what I hired you for. I know the agreement, and I know what's fair, and I'm not trying to. What I'm about to say isn't about the agreement." He opened the notebook, looked at something in it, closed it again. "You turned down St. Louis." She was still. "How did you know about that?" "Edith told me. She heard it from... She has her ways." He set the notebook on the table. "She told me because she thought I should know, because she thought I might be..." He stopped, restarted. "She thought I might be too slow to say something if I didn't know there was a reason to say it. Edith Hale sent you in here. Edith Hale informed me that the window was open and that I might want to decide whether I was going through it." He looked at her directly. "That's a different thing." It was technically a different thing. Margaret kept her hands on the bread dough because having something to do with her hands was the only way she was going to get through this conversation without her face doing something she'd regret. "I'm going to say this plain," Silas said. "I'm not good at the other kind." He put both hands flat on the table, a gesture she'd noticed him make when he was committing to something. The physical declaration of a man planting his feet. "You've been here 7 weeks. In 7 weeks you have. The children are different. The men are different. This house is different. He stopped on that one, didn't finish it. "I know that's the job. I know that's what I brought you here for and what you've done well, but that's not why I'm sitting here." He looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," he said. "It's not simple. It's barely been a year since Catherine. And you have your own. You carry your own things that aren't resolved. I know that. I'm not asking you to set any of that aside or to pretend it isn't there." He picked up the notebook and put it down again. "What I'm asking, what I want to ask, is whether there's a version of the future where you're here, not as the cook, as..." He chose the word carefully. "As a partner. To this ranch, to these children, to..." And then he ran out of words, which was probably inevitable for a man who had told her on the first day that he wasn't good at the other kind. The kitchen was quiet enough that the fire in the range was audible. Margaret looked at the bread dough under her hands. She thought about what she'd been thinking about since the night she'd written to Dorothy. The seed list, the spring garden, Claire's face over the stew, Will's 3 bowls, Roy fixing the barn door without being asked, Hector in the dark on the wagon giving her reasons to stay. She thought about the photograph at the bottom of her bag that she still hadn't been able to look at, and about the fact that the not looking had gotten slightly less necessary over these weeks, without her quite noticing when that had shifted. She thought about what it meant to build something versus what it meant to maintain something, and how she had been maintaining for a long time, and this was the first thing in a year that had felt like building. "I told you in October," she said, "that I wasn't going to promise things further than I could keep them." "I remember. That's still true." She looked up at him. "I can't tell you I'm certain. I can't tell you the future without lying, and I won't do that to you or to those children." She held his gaze. "But I can tell you that I've been planning for spring as if I was going to be here, and I've been doing that because it felt right. Not because I was told to, because it felt like, this is where the work is, the real kind." He was watching her carefully. "That's not a no," he said. "It's not a no. Is it a yes?" She was quiet for a moment. "It's a yes to trying," she said. To doing it honestly, without pretending it's simpler than it is. Yes to staying through the spring and seeing what we're building and deciding from there with clear eyes. She paused. That's what I have. If that's enough to work with, it's enough, he said. He said it fast enough that it was clearly true, rather than considered. She looked at him, he looked at her. It was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense. She had flour on her hands and he had mud on his boots, and the kitchen smelled like bread, and the range was clicking, and there was nothing cinematic about any of it. But it was real, which was, she had learned, worth considerably more than cinematic. All right, she said. She went back to the bread. After a moment, he said, I should tell Clara and Will. Yes. How do I... He stopped. How do I tell them in a way that... Tell them honestly, she said. Tell them what it is. Children know when they're being managed, Clara especially. I know. He picked up his notebook, put it in his jacket pocket, stood up. Margaret. She looked up. Thank you, he said, for everything before this conversation. That was just the job, she said. No, it wasn't. He left before she could answer that. She stood at the work table and looked at the bread dough for a moment, at the impression her hands had left in it. Then she started working it again. It still needed time. Everything did. The conversation with the children happened the next morning at breakfast, and it did not go the way anyone planned it, because nothing with children went the way it was planned. Silas sat across from Clara and Will at the dining room table, and he had clearly thought about this overnight and had arrived at some version of what he wanted to say. He got about 2 sentences in. I wanted to talk to you both about Margaret and about whether things might change a little here. Before Will said, with the directness of a 6-year-old who had not had enough sleep, Is she going to be our mother? Silas stopped. Clara looked at Will. Will looked at his father. That's, Silas started. What I'm saying is, because Pete said you were sweet on her, Will said. He said it to Hector and I heard. From the kitchen doorway, where Margaret had absolutely not been standing in order to listen, she had simply been passing through at an inopportune moment. She heard this and closed her eyes briefly. Pete, Silas said, in the tone of a man mentally reassigning ranch duties, is going to be building fence for the rest of the winter. Is she, though? Will pressed. Clara said nothing. She was watching her father with an expression so carefully controlled it was its own kind of answer. The expression of someone who wanted something very much and was not going to show it until it was safe to. We're going to see, Silas said. That's the honest answer. We're all going to try, and we're going to see. Will thought about this for a long time, in the particular way he processed things. Slow, thorough, arriving at conclusions on his own schedule. Then, okay, he said, but if she makes soup on my birthday, I want 3 bowls. That can be arranged, Margaret said from the doorway. Will turned and looked at her without surprise, which suggested he had known she was there. How old do you have to be to learn to cook? He asked. No minimum age, she said. You have to be able to reach the stove. He looked at the stove, assessed the height differential between himself and it. I'm going to need a box. We'll find you a box. Clara across the table had let something happen to her face at last. It wasn't a smile. It was the thing that lived one layer below a smile. The dropping of the guard, the letting go of the held breath. She looked at her father, and then at Margaret, and then down at her plate, and she picked up her fork and started eating with an appetite she hadn't shown at the beginning of any meal since Margaret had arrived. And that, more than anything else, more than any conversation or decision made at any work table, was the moment that settled it. Not perfect, not resolved, just settling. The way good dough settled when you'd worked it right, ready for what came next. The men found out through Pete, because Pete, despite the fence assignment, could not keep anything to himself for longer than 48 hours. Roy received the information with a nod. Hector received it with no visible reaction whatsoever, which was Hector confirming that he had known for some time. The others, 3 men she'd been feeding and learning for 7 weeks, responded with the specific variety of male approval that expressed itself through increased productivity, which meant that the woodpile, which had been adequate, became impressively large over the following 3 days, and the broken gate latch on the chicken coop that Margaret had mentioned twice was repaired without anyone telling her it had been done. She discovered it when she went for eggs, and the gate swung true for the first time. She stood at the coop for a moment, gate in her hand, and thought about all the ways people showed the things they couldn't say. It was Edith Hale who surprised her most. 2 days after Silas had sat at the kitchen table, 2 days after Will had asked his direct question and Clara had let her face do the thing it did, Edith Hale knocked on the frame of the open kitchen door on a Sunday afternoon. She was holding something, a box, wooden, small, the kind used for recipe cards. "These were Catherine's," she said. She came to the work table and set the box down. Her recipes, her mother's recipes, some of them go back further than that. She didn't look at Margaret. She looked at the box. "I've been keeping them in my room since February. I told myself it was because I didn't want them lost or—" She stopped. "I was holding on to them. Mrs. Hale, I want you to have them." She looked up now. "Not to replace your own. You don't need that, and this isn't about—" She pressed her hands flat on the work table, the gesture Margaret recognized. "Catherine would have liked you," she said. "I think she would have liked you very much, and these should be in this kitchen, being used." Margaret looked at the box, then at Edith. "This is not easy for you," Margaret said. "No," Edith said. "Very little worth doing is." She left the box on the table and left the kitchen with the brisk, purposeful movement of a woman who has done something that cost her and is not going to make more of it than necessary. Margaret opened the box. The cards inside were handwritten, some in a hand she didn't know, and some in another, Catherine's, she assumed, and Catherine's mother's before. The ink was different ages. Some cards were stained, the marks of actual use, flour and fat and time. One recipe for apple cake had a note in the margin in a different ink. "Will loves this. Make for his birthday." Written recently, the ink still relatively dark. Written by a woman who had not known, when she wrote it, that she would not be here for the birthday. Margaret closed the box. She put it on the shelf above the work table, the same shelf where she kept her own herbs, her own notes, the small tin of dried things she'd carried from Nashville. She put it there like it belonged there, because it did. This kitchen held more than one woman's knowledge now. That was not a loss of something. It was the kitchen becoming what kitchens were supposed to be. She had a chicken broth on. She went back to it. The week before Christmas was busy in the specific way frontier winters made things busy, not the social busyness of a city. December, but the pressing practical business of making sure everything was prepared, the root cellar accounted for, the livestock protected, the wood stacked right, the household in the kind of order that could withstand 3 weeks of the road being impassable if the weather decided to make that a reality. Margaret worked through it with the same methodical attention she gave everything, and Clara worked beside her on the mornings she wasn't in school, and Will visited the kitchen with his horse and his questions, and Silas stopped in the evenings, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they just occupied the same space, in a silence that had become comfortable in the way that only shared work could make silence comfortable. It was not simple. She hadn't said yes to simple. There were evenings when Silas went somewhere in his head that she couldn't follow, when he looked at the empty chair at the head of the table and came back from it slowly, and she gave him time and space and didn't pretend she hadn't seen it. There were mornings when she woke up, and the first thing her mind reached for was Anna, always Anna, the weight of it unchanged and probably unchangeable, a fact she was carrying rather than a wound she was healing, and she was learning to tell the difference between those two things. There were moments with Clara when the girl shut down suddenly and completely, retreated behind her careful face without warning, and for reasons that weren't always legible, and Margaret had to sit with the uncertainty of not knowing if she'd said the wrong thing, or if Clara was simply being 10 and motherless and complicated, which was its own answer. None of it was smooth. None of it was resolved. But the day before Christmas, something happened that clarified things in a way that none of the larger events had quite managed. She was teaching Clara to make pie crust. Pie crust was unforgiving, more unforgiving than most things, because it required a specific touch, a specific temperature of hands, a specific understanding of when to stop working the dough. And that last part was the hardest because it was judgment rather than instruction. You had to feel it. Clara had made 2 failed attempts already. The first had been overworked and came out of the oven like a shingle. The second had been better but cracked at the edges. "You're thinking about it too hard," Margaret said. "I'm thinking about doing it right," Clara said. "Same problem." She moved behind Clara and adjusted the angle of her hands on the dough. "Here. Like this. Light. You're not shaping it, you're just getting it to agree with you. That doesn't make sense. It will eventually. Clara worked the dough with the corrected grip. Her jaw was set in concentration, her mother's dark eyes focused on her hands. Is it right? She asked. Close, Margaret said. A little more. There. Stop. Clara stopped. That's it, Margaret said. Clara looked at the dough, then at Margaret. That's the right feeling? That's the right feeling. A pause. Clara looked back at the dough with the expression of someone trying to memorize something kinetic, something that lived in the hands and not in the head. How do I remember it? You'll make it enough times that you don't have to remember it, Margaret said. It'll just be the thing your hands know. Clara was quiet for a moment, working the dough the way Margaret had shown her. Then, without looking up, I'm glad you didn't go to St. Louis. Margaret kept her voice even. Yeah? I looked on Papa's map, Clara said. St. Louis is very far. It is. And you already know where the good herbs are in the garden. She said it like this was a conclusive argument, which, Margaret thought, it probably was, on the terms that mattered most to a practical 10-year-old girl. Roll it out now, Margaret said. Slow. Away from you. Clara started rolling. The dough held. She reached the edge and stopped and looked at the circle she'd made, not quite even, slightly thicker on the left. Good enough, nearly right, the work of someone learning. It's not perfect, Clara said. It doesn't need to be perfect, Margaret said. It needs to be pie crust. Clara looked at it for another moment, then picked up the rolling pin and made one more careful pass across the thicker edge, smoothing it toward what it needed to be. Okay, she said. I think that's right. I think so too, Margaret said. The pie went in the oven. Clara stood at the range watching the oven door as if her looking would help, which was not true and was also completely understandable. Margaret washed the flour off her hands and looked at the kitchen, the recipe box on the shelf, the rosemary she'd hung to dry above the window, the grain of the old oak work table she'd come to know like a road map, the morning light coming in at the angle it came in at in December, low and amber and specific to this place. She thought about everything that had brought her through that gate in October, about how she had stood in this kitchen and looked at near-empty shelves and seen possibilities rather than failure because there was nothing left in her life to do except see possibilities or stop entirely, and stopping wasn't something she was made for. She had not known, standing there, that staying would look like this. She had not known a lot of things. The oven ticked. Outside, Silas and Will were in the yard. She could hear Will's voice carrying, high and clear in the cold air, saying something she couldn't make out, and Silas's response, lower, and then Will's laugh. She hadn't heard Will laugh like that very often. It was the laugh of a child who had forgotten, briefly, to be careful. Clara heard it too. She looked at the window, then at the oven, then at the window again. Go, Margaret said. I'll watch the pie. It needs 7 more minutes. I know. Go. Clara went. Margaret heard the screen door bang behind her, heard her boots on the porch steps, heard her voice join the other 2 outside in the yard. She stood at the range alone in the kitchen. The pie had 6 minutes left. She could smell it already. The crust catching its color, the filling beginning to bubble at the edges, the specific smell of something made from effort and time, and the ordinary miracle of heat. She watched the oven door. She had 6 minutes, and then there would be pie, and then the day would continue. That was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. Christmas came and went without fanfare, which was how Briar Ridge had handled it apparently even before February. Silas being a man who found large celebrations faintly suspicious. Margaret made a proper dinner. Roast chicken, the last of the stored squash done with butter and sage, a cranberry preserve she'd put up in November from a crate of dried fruit Mrs. Osterhaus had talked her into buying, Clara's pie, which had come out better than the practice run. Edith Hale brought a bottle of port she'd been keeping since the previous December and set it on the table without ceremony, and Silas poured small glasses for the adults, and Will asked for some and was declined and accepted this with only moderate protest. It was not a perfect Christmas. Will cried briefly before bed, not dramatically, just suddenly, the way grief ambushed children without scheduling ahead, and Clara spent part of the afternoon in her room with the door closed, which Margaret left her to, because some things needed private time, and Clara had the right to her own. Silas sat by the front window in the early evening with his port and was somewhere else for a while. And Margaret did not go to him and did not give him space that felt like abandonment. She stayed in the kitchen, where he could hear her moving, where the sounds of the house being tended reached him like a hand on a shoulder that doesn't grab, just rests. By 8 o'clock, they were all in the front room together. Will had fallen asleep against Edith's arm, which had surprised them both, Edith included. Clara was reading. Silas had come back from wherever he'd been. The fire was doing what fires did in December, which was the most useful thing any fire had ever done. Next year, Will said, half asleep, addressing no one in particular, I want a bigger chicken. Next year we'll have a bigger chicken, Margaret said. Promise? She looked at the top of his head, his eyes already closing. Yes, she said. I promise that. It was the first promise she'd made that reached past tomorrow. She felt it settle in her chest like something clicked into place. January was the hardest month. She had been warned by everyone who had an opinion about Colorado winters, Mrs. Osterhaus, Eleanor Henderson, Hector's wife. When Margaret had finally met her on the last supply run before the roads closed, that January was the month that tested what you were made of. They were right. The cold came down from the north in a way that felt personal, the temperature dropping low enough at night that the water in the kitchen basin had a thin skin of ice on it by morning, despite the banked fire. And the days were short and gray, and the wind found every gap in every wall and made its opinion known. The roads closed for 11 days in the second week of January, completely impassable. The ranch existed as its own world, no contact with Garnet Fork or the Hendersons or anyone outside the fence line, and whatever they had was what they had. Margaret had planned for this. The root cellar was stocked. The flour and salt were adequate. The preserved things she'd put up through November, the cranberries, the dried beans she'd properly stored, the lard rendered from the hog Silas had butchered in late November, were exactly where she'd calculated they needed to be. What she hadn't planned for was what 11 days of confinement did to people. By day 4, Pete had gotten into an argument with Roy about the correct way to resole a boot, which escalated in the way bored men's arguments escalated, and Hector had intervened with the quiet authority of a man who had been managing other men for decades, and the crisis passed, but the temperature in the bunkhouse was different afterward. On day 6, Clara announced at breakfast that she didn't want to do her lessons. Delivered this announcement with an edge that had nothing to do with lessons and everything to do with being 10 and trapped and missing the particular shape of her life before everything went wrong, and Silas started to respond in a way that would have made things worse, and Margaret said simply, Clara, come help me with the bread. And Clara came, furious. And they worked in silence until the fury burned off into something more manageable, the dough absorbing what needed absorbing. Will, by some miracle of temperament, was largely fine. He had his horse, he had his drawings, he had the kitchen doorway and Margaret's counting, and he had discovered during the confinement that if you watched the snow through the window long enough, it started to look like something, and he would report these things to whoever was nearby. That drift looks like a sleeping dog. That one looks like a hat. On day 9, unprompted, he came to Margaret at the range and said, Can I try the stirring? She gave him the spoon. She put her hand over his and showed him the motion. He counted under his breath, very seriously, lips moving. 30? He said. Check it. He lifted the spoon, looked at what came off it, put it back. It needs more, he said. 10 more. He stirred 10 more. Checked again. Now? Now. He looked pleased with this in the contained way he looked pleased with things. Not jumping, not announcing it, just a small internal satisfaction that showed in his eyes. I counted 40, he said. Sometimes it's 40, she said. You have to check, not just count. He handed her the spoon back. Okay, he said. He went back to the doorway, picked up his horse. Margaret? Yeah. Is cooking always like that? You have a number, but the number isn't the real thing? She thought about this seriously because he was asking seriously. A lot of things are like that, she said. The number is just where you start paying attention. He turned this over, nodded, filed it somewhere, went back to his snow watching. The roads opened on a Thursday, and Hector was in the wagon before anyone had fully registered that the world was accessible again. And when he came back, he had mail, because mail waited for no weather and simply accumulated in Garnet Fork until someone came to collect it. There was a letter for Margaret. Nashville postmark, a hand she didn't recognize. She opened it in the kitchen after supper. It was from her husband's sister, Ruth, who she had not heard from in 8 months, since the memorial, since the last of the formalities that grief required, since Margaret had left Nashville with her bag and her letter and gone west to Abilene and then north and then here. Ruth wrote carefully, the letter of someone who had been composing things in her head for a long time and had finally committed them to paper. She wrote about Thomas, Margaret's husband, and about Anna, and about that year, and she wrote, "I have thought about you often, Margaret, and wondered where you had come to rest. I hope you have found something worth staying for. Thomas would have wanted that. Anna would have wanted that. You were always the one of us who knew how to make a place livable, wherever you were. I hope you are using that somewhere good." Margaret read the letter twice, folded it, set it on the table. She sat there for a while. Then she went to her room, the former storage room, the cot and washstand, and the small mirror, and she reached into the bag for the first time since October with intention. She found the muslin-wrapped square at the bottom, beneath the stockings, and she took it out and sat on the edge of the cot and unfolded it. The photograph. Thomas at 30, a formal portrait done in Nashville the year before Will was born, before Anna, taken when it was just the two of them, and they had no idea yet what the next 4 years would bring. He was looking slightly past the camera, the way people did when photographers told them not to blink, and there was something in his expression that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. She knew that expression. She knew it better than she knew most things. Anna she carried differently, not in a photograph, because Anna had not lived long enough to sit still for one, but in a specific weight in her chest that she was no longer trying to put down and no longer being crushed by, which was its own kind of progress. The progress of someone learning to carry a thing correctly so that the carrying itself became possible. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said, to the room, to no one, to the particular empty frequency on which she still sometimes addressed the people who were gone. "I found somewhere good." She put the photograph on the washstand, not back in the bag, on the stand where she could see it. She went back to the kitchen. Spring came the way spring came in Colorado. Not gently, not in a straight line, but in a negotiation with winter that went on for 6 or 7 weeks. Warm days followed by cold snaps, followed by mud, followed by the first genuine warmth that you could finally trust. March was a mess. April was complicated. By the first week of May, the ground had made up its mind. Margaret and Clara worked the kitchen garden together over 3 consecutive Saturdays, turning the soil, breaking the clods that had compacted over winter, working in the compost that Hector had been building in the east corner of the yard since February, because Margaret had asked him to, and he had done it without commentary. The seed order arrived in late March, slightly delayed, and Margaret had spread everything out on the kitchen table and gone through it with Clara the way her mother had gone through it with her. This variety does better in dry soil. This one needs more water. These two don't like each other as neighbors. "Plants have preferences," Clara had said. "Plants have preferences," Margaret confirmed. "Most things do." Clara had written notes in a small notebook she'd gotten for Christmas. She wrote everything down with the seriousness of a person who understood that knowledge was worth keeping. At the bottom of one page, underneath the planting notes for the beet section, she had written in her careful 10-year-old hand, "Margaret says the best things take longer. Plant early, be patient." Margaret saw it once by accident and didn't mention it. Some things were better left as private conclusions. The formal ceremony, which was not a ceremony exactly, because neither Silas nor Margaret were people given to ceremony, happened on a Saturday in late April when the mud had mostly dried and the garden was half planted and the light was doing the specific thing spring light did after a hard winter, which was arriving with a generosity that felt slightly unearned and was welcome anyway. Silas had asked her the week before quietly, in the kitchen, whether she wanted the thing done proper. A justice of the peace in Garnet Fork, witnesses if she wanted them. She'd thought about it and said yes, not because she needed the ceremony, but because the children needed to see it done, needed the tangible evidence of a commitment made in front of people, which was different from the commitment already living in the day-to-day of the house. So they went to Garnet Fork on a Saturday, Silas and Margaret and Clara and Will and Edith Hale, who wore her best dress and sat in the front of the wagon with a posture of such rigid dignity that it was its own kind of statement, and the justice of the peace, a compact, no-nonsense man named Webb, who had been performing this function in Colfax County for 15 years, married them in the room behind his office in 12 minutes. It was not a long ceremony. Webb asked the necessary questions, and they gave the necessary answers, and he pronounced the thing done and shook Silas's hand and told Margaret he'd heard about her cooking from the Hendersons, and she was welcome in this county. Will, who had been standing beside Clara with his horse under his arm through the entire proceeding, said, "Is it finished?" "It's finished," Silas said. "Okay." He looked at Margaret. "Can we get something to eat? I'm hungry." They ate at the counter of the Garnet Fork General Store, Mrs. Osterhaus having produced, with a kind of pleased unsurprisedness that suggested she'd been preparing for this, a plate of cold sliced ham and a fresh batch of biscuits that were, Margaret noted with professional fairness, not bad. Not bad at all. "Your biscuits have improved," she told Mrs. Osterhaus. "I had advice," Mrs. Osterhaus said, with a look that suggested the advice had come through channels Margaret would recognize. Edith Hale ate her biscuit and said, "Adequate," which from Edith was essentially a standing ovation. Clara sat on the store counter beside her father because there weren't enough chairs and nobody made her get down, and she ate her ham with an appetite that had become reliable over the past months. The careful restraint of those first weeks worn away by enough good meals and enough safe mornings that her body had finally started believing the food would keep coming. On the wagon ride home, Will fell asleep against Margaret's arm, heavy and boneless the way sleeping children were, his horse tucked against his chest. The afternoon light came across the plains at the low gold angle of late April, turning the new grass the color of something you wanted to remember. The mountains in the west were still snow-capped, white against a sky that had finally decided to be blue. Clara, sitting on Margaret's other side, said nothing for a long time, then, "The beets should be showing by next week." "Probably," Margaret said. "I'm going to check them every morning." "That's a good idea." A pause. Then Clara leaned very slightly against Margaret's shoulder. Not dramatically, just leaned. The way a person leaned on something they'd decided they could trust with their weight. Margaret did not move, did not make anything of it, just stayed exactly where she was, which was where she was needed. The ranch was visible now in the distance, the fence line first, then the barn, then the house, the smoke from the kitchen chimney where Hector had agreed to keep the fire banked while they were in town. Ordinary and imperfect, and hers in the way that things became yours, not through ownership, but through the accumulated weight of care poured into them over time. She thought about this woman who had stood at that gate in October with a worn bag and 31 cents. She thought about what that woman had been looking for. Not a job, not exactly, though she'd needed one. Something more basic. The thing you look for when everything else has been taken and you have to find out what you're actually made of underneath the losses. She had found out. What she was made of was this: patience, when patience was the only tool available. Honesty, even when lying would have been easier and kinder in the short term. The stubbornness to keep cooking when the shelves were bare, and the stubbornness to stay when the roads to somewhere easier were open. The understanding that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a weight to be carried, and that carrying it didn't prevent you from carrying other things alongside it. And the knowledge, earned, not given, that starting over was not the same as losing what came before. That you could hold Thomas in a photograph on a washstand and Anna in the specific place in your chest that nothing else could fill, and still be fully present in a kitchen on the Colorado frontier at 6 in the morning counting stirs, still be building something real with people who needed building alongside. You didn't have to choose between honoring what was gone and living in what was here. That was the thing nobody had told her, or maybe they had, and she hadn't been able to hear it yet. Either way, she knew it now, in the way you knew things that lived in the body rather than the head. Silas pulled the wagon through the gate. The dog lifted its head from the porch steps and regarded their arrival with the same indifference it had shown Margaret on the first day, then put its head back down. Some things didn't change. Will woke up when the wagon stopped, blinking and uncertain about where he was for a moment in the specific way of children roused mid-sleep. He looked at Margaret, looked at the house. "We're home," he said. Not a question. "We're home," she said. He climbed down from the wagon with his horse and walked to the porch and went inside without looking back, with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where he belongs. Clara climbed down after him, more carefully, and stopped at the porch steps and looked at the garden plot visible around the east corner of the house, looking for her beets. Then she went inside. Edith Hale descended from the wagon front with the assistance of no one, because she was Edith Hale, and walked to the front door and paused and said, without turning, "I'll start the evening fire." "Thank you, Edith," Margaret said. A slight nod. She went inside. Silas wrapped the reins and sat for a moment before climbing down. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon seat in the late afternoon light, the ranch spread around them, the mountains beyond. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, more honest, "Mostly. Mostly is fine," he said. "Mostly is what most days are." "That's not an inspiring sentiment." "No," he agreed. "It's true, though." She looked at the house, at the smoke from the chimney, at the garden fence where the beets were underground doing whatever beets did in late April, which was the slow, invisible work of becoming what they were going to be. "The south bed needs another foot of compost before we can plant the tomatoes," she said. "I'll tell Hector. And the window frame in the kitchen still needs proper repair, before summer. I've got the lumber." "Good." She climbed down from the wagon, stood in the yard with the late light on her face. "Come inside when you're done with the horses. I'll have something ready by 6. "Margaret." She turned. He was looking at her from the wagon seat with the expression she'd learned over these months, the one that lived 1 degree past what he said out loud, the one that meant all the things he didn't have the words for and had stopped apologizing for not having. "I'm glad you stopped at the gate," he said. She held that for a moment. Let it be what it was. "Me too," she said. She went inside. The kitchen was cool, but the banked fire caught quickly when she opened the damper, and within 10 minutes the room was warming, and the familiar sounds of the range were starting up their ticking conversation, and she put water on and went to the pantry and stood looking at the shelves. They were full. Not extravagantly. This was a frontier ranch, not a city house, and there would be lean weeks again, and there would be months when the road to Garnet Fork was a theoretical concept, and they'd live on what they had. But full in the real sense, stocked with intention, evidence of someone who had looked at what was needed and provided it. She pulled out what she needed for supper, came back to the work table, found the notebook where she wrote her menus, opened it to tomorrow's page, and wrote the week out in her clear hand. What she'd make, what she'd need, what was coming in from the garden soon. The seeds underground, the beets Clara was going to check every morning, the tomatoes that needed another foot of compost, the rosemary, enormous and wild, that had survived a winter no one had promised it would survive. She started cooking. Outside, she could hear Will in the yard now, his voice carrying. He was talking to something, the dog probably, or to himself, or to his horse, in the way children talk to things they loved without caring whether they were listening. Clara's footsteps crossed the floor above her, purposeful, going somewhere with intention. Hector's voice from the direction of the barn, steady and low. The ordinary percussion of a ranch evening settling into itself. Margaret stood at the range and she counted her strokes, and her lips moved, and she did not rush the thing she was making because she had learned, or maybe relearned, that the only way to make something that lasted was to give it the time it actually needed, rather than the time you wished it needed. 30. She checked. Not yet. 10 more. She stirred. The kitchen filled with warmth. The window above the work table went amber with the last of the day's light, then pink, then the deep blue of early evening coming down over the mountains. The fire talked to itself in the range. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed, and footsteps came toward the kitchen, and Will appeared in the doorway. Not with his horse this time, just himself, hands in his pockets, watching her. "What are you making?" he asked. "Supper." "What kind?" "The kind that takes as long as it takes," she said. He came and leaned against the door frame, watched her. After a while, "Can I stir?" She handed him the spoon. He came to the range and she stood beside him, not guiding his hands this time, just standing there in case he needed her, and he stirred on his own, slowly, carefully, counting under his breath the way she'd taught him. He got to 30 and stopped and looked at her. "Check it," she said. He checked it, looked at the spoon, looked at her. "It's ready," he said. "It's ready," she confirmed. He handed the spoon back, stood at the range beside her for a moment longer, the heat of it on both their faces, the kitchen holding them in its ordinary particular warmth. "Margaret," he said. "Yeah, I like it here now." She looked at him. 6 years old, with his father's dark eyes and whatever was his own, the patience, the watchfulness, the directness that went straight to the thing without dressing it up. "I like it here too," she said. He nodded, satisfied. He went to set the table without being asked. She turned back to the stove. Outside the kitchen window, the first stars were coming out over the Colorado plain, one at a time, the way they always did. Nothing dramatic, just the sky doing what it had always done and would keep doing, enormous and indifferent and very beautiful. The kind of beautiful that didn't require anyone to notice it to be what it was. She put the lid on the pot. Supper was ready.